Chapter 6. First Summer. I figured I would eventually get used to it, and we make do, because really, what other choice do we have? But I miss air conditioning. I really, really miss it. It's been, over 10 years now? And when that crazy, hot, muggy summer heat hits, I just sit around like a limp noodle. Ugh. It's hard to believe that my grandparents grew up without it, and all the generations before that. Of all the things I miss, having that ice-cold air conditioner is near the top of my list. Jess's journal. Sweat trickled down Jess's face. The sun beat mercilessly down on her as she moved through the backyard. On the back porch, the solar oven had 2 loaves of bread inside, and they had been baking for over 2 hours. The heavenly smell she kept getting whiffs of indicated it would soon be time to take them out. For now, she ignored the smell of the bread and the heat of the sun, and continued tying the tomato plants up. The heat had spiked a few weeks ago and invaded every corner of the house and yard. The tomatoes seemed to be the only living thing that thrived. Jess and the others had all moved down to the basement. The slightly cooler temperatures were a relief from the unending heat, and they slept, windows open at night, desperate for a breeze. Thankfully, the screens on the 2 tiny windows were intact. This prevented a majority of the voracious swarms of mosquitoes from feasting on them. Some still made it through, as the itchy red lumps on Jess's arms and legs could attest to. The unrelenting heat was hardest on Jacob, since he was only a baby and unable to regulate his internal temperature as easily as Jess and David. Even Tina struggled with the heat, turning red quickly and losing her appetite. She got her wish to hold Jacob more, the 2 of them relegated to the basement, while Jess and David handled what they could of the gardening and chores. Jess was worn out from struggling to pull a cart loaded with water from the creek. The only nice part about this duty was the messiness of it. They would pull a hand cart loaded with 1 or 2 large rain barrels to the creek, then use buckets to fill them, which meant she was soaked down the front of her shirt and pants within minutes. When the barrels were full, they would turn the cart around and slowly pull it the 3 blocks back home, taking care to navigate the chewed-up blacktop and various obstacles, mainly bricks and wood from the collapsed and burnt houses, strewn about. It was hard work pulling the cart back. The slightest incline involved muscles she hadn't known she had. Once back, they would hook up a short hose to the spigot near the bottom of the barrel, letting a barrel drain slowly into 1 or 2 of the raised beds. When the barrel was empty, they would switch to the other one and drain it as well. 1 trip in the early morning to water selected beds in the backyard, and 1 trip in the evening to water the backyard, thus avoiding direct sunlight. Until they could dig a well, it was their only option for keeping the plants alive. They had also decided to allow their new flock of chickens to run free of the confines of their protected chicken coop and yard during the day, after 2 of the younger hens who had just begun laying died from overheating. The odd little flock of 9 laying hens and 1 rooster had been cobbled together from donations by townspeople. For a few weeks, after they had help from Thurman Banks repairing the chicken house and coop, which was intact except for 1 smashed window, Jess and David received a bird here and a bird there. A neighbor would show up at their door, squawking chicken in 1 hand, a packet of seeds or some bread in another. 1 or 2 of the hens looked a lot like the Americana birds that Jess's mom, Julie, had owned. Jess later concluded that they must be Americanas when they found a stash of medium-sized, pale green eggs. Others were larger breeds that lay large brown eggs. With a rooster to fertilize the eggs, it was possible that they could enlarge their flock quickly if they continued to have broody hens. "If we just lock them up at night so the possums and coons don't get 'em, then let them out in the morning, they can be free to find the coolest part of the yard," David had suggested. It had proven to be the perfect solution, and the chickens could often be found resting under the shade of tomato plants in the cool dirt, or in a dark corner of the fence under the grapevines. It had its drawbacks, though. They tended to nibble on the tomatoes and had completely demolished the grapes before Jess and David devised a barrier with chicken wire. A tiny warble at her elbow startled Jess. One of the hens was eyeing her curiously. She was one of the Americana, one that looked distinctive enough from the rest to be named. Tina had decided to call her Little Miss Crankyfoot, or Cranky for short, because the young hen was anything but cranky. The rest would run from Jess and the others, but not Cranky. Jess figured Cranky's brain had to be just a tad bigger than the rest. She stayed close to Jess and David, watching as they dug into the earth, and was rewarded with tasty grubs, fat green tomato hornworms, and now, as the summer progressed, juicy grasshoppers. Jess spied one now and tossed it to Cranky, who devoured it quickly. Work on the house was moving slowly now. Everything moved slowly in this oppressive heat. The rooms had slowly been cleaned out. Furniture, dishes, books, and more, some of it quite familiar, often appeared overnight on the front stoop. Old Mr. Banks had explained it kindly one evening when he showed up with a butchered goat for the family and then stayed for supper.
Folks did what they had to survive, Jessie. Along the way, they maybe saw stuff that was nice or made 'em smile, and they picked that up, too. After all, someone who is gone, they don't need that stuff anymore, right? It wasn't stealing, per se, just filling a tiny desire. You understand, right, Jessie?
His eyes pleaded with her to accept that what was taken would find its way back in due time, and Jess shrugged and nodded. Hadn't she done much the same thing in countless other places along the way? The day her mother's cameo, handed down through 3 generations of women before her, returned, still nestled in its worn, velvet-lined box, she sat down on the front stoop and cried. It made her miss her mom even more. The remnants of the once thriving town of over 20,000 souls was tattered and threadbare. A mere 1 in 30 had survived. Despite this, or perhaps because of the loss of so many, those left pulled together wherever and whenever possible. Jess could count on one hand the number of meals she and her family had missed since their arrival in March. It was hard for her, though, to ask for help. Sarah Turner had given Jess a stern talking to a few weeks before when she learned that there was a gaping hole in the roof, which poured rain straight into the master bedroom. "Don't be a fool, Jessie," she had said to her as she surveyed the damage. The floor had buckled and part of the drywall had collapsed. Soon it would affect their nest down in the basement. "This isn't safe for the baby or any of you. The rain will lead to mold, and then you will have some real problems on your hands. If we can't find someone to help you fix it, you'll have to move into the dorms they've set up at research. But that's been a hotbed for some bad strains of flu through the winter. I'd hate to see you or the kids get that." Research had been the local medical center, and part of it had been turned into a form of housing for orphans and the elderly after so many of the children lost their parents in a series of raids, first from the Western Front, and later from bands of starving families holed up in the city. The old folks' home had been set on fire with most of the occupants inside, but the elderly who had lived on their own were now forced through need to live in the old hospital. In some ways, being around so many of the kids had saved many of the senior citizens from fading away to nothing. The kids needed them, after all. The last 2 winters had been hard ones. Food shortages in the first winter immediately following the first invasion had taken their toll. With lack of food had come higher susceptibility to illness. The last onslaught of flu had killed all but a handful of the senior citizens and put a serious dent in the younger population as well. Jess had heard the stories, and Sarah's admonition to get the house in order was taken seriously. A week later, the ripped tarp was pulled away, and a handful of the younger men from the militia were hard at work, with a former owner of a local construction company supervising their progress. 2 days after that, the hole had been completely repaired, including the rotting drywall, patched from intact drywall salvaged from a home a few blocks away that had partially burned in the invasion. Jess had cleaned the room, and after a full-size mattress and box springs mysteriously appeared on their doorstep the next day, she had moved the bed and her meager belongings into the master bedroom. The heat had kept her downstairs, but she knew it wouldn't always be this hot. Eventually, the nights would cool and she would actually have a room to herself. Mostly, considering that Jacob would be sharing it with her. It felt strange to take this room that had been her parents'. Looking around it, she could see the ghostly shapes of where each piece of furniture had stood, and the shadows of their presence still lingered in outlines on the floor. One of the bedroom windows was broken. The former construction company owner, Mr. Kinsey, had offered to find a replacement window, but Jess had shook her head and just asked that it be boarded over. She was relieved Sarah wasn't there to lecture her or to go above her head and insist that Mr. Kinsey find a window for her. Having the roof intact was good enough, and she knew that she already owed enough for all of the help others had extended to her. Jess had been lost in her thoughts for a while. Her back and knees were sore from crouching at the tomato vines, and her fingers were rough and chapped from the twine she was using to tie the vines with. As she looked around, Jess found herself feeling almost safe. Twice in the last month, the militia had repelled invaders, killing the ones who were armed, and no one from Belton had been hurt in the process. A small knot of cattle lowed peaceably nearby. The strong smell of them had become something of a comfort. All of her little family were filling out. The bones jutted less, and she had noticed her hair felt thicker and less brittle. Jess could also see the difference in Jacob's activity level as well as his size. He had begun crawling and gurgled happily, keeping all three of them busy taking turns watching him. She had even heard Tina, so serious and quiet for her 4 years, laugh freely the other day. For that matter, David too seemed happier. They were adjusting. It had been nearly a year now, Jess realized suddenly, since she had first met David and Tina. Nearly a year since Jacob had been born in the middle of that storm. What had happened to that soldier who had found them that night? She remembered him standing there, ready to fire, the rain soaking him, the wind lashing the trees in the background. He had looked so tired, so sad when he saw Jacob, naked, covered in afterbirth, his umbilical cord still attached. His young face had been lined with grief at the memory of his own son. "I had a son once. His name was Jacob." She hadn't thought of the soldier for a long time. Not much at all since that first night, the memory of him lost in the simple and basic struggle for survival in the days, weeks, and months that followed. For the first time, she found herself pierced by a sharp curiosity. All the stories, all the lives cut short or forever altered by the events of the past 2 years. What was Sarah's story? Where did she and her kids come from? And Grandmother Madge, where were her children now? How could she tell them the story of their mother? Jess looked down to find her left hand clenched around a thin, long shred of mulch, clutching it as she would a pen. Before it had all come to such a terrible end, her life here in Belton before the invasion had been filled with scribbles, as her brother Chris had called them. "When you aren't reading, you're scribbling," he had teased her good-naturedly, "and sometimes it's both." For nearly 2 years, she hadn't written a thing. The journals were gone and hadn't mysteriously returned on the stoop like so many other things. Suddenly, she felt that familiar longing, deep within her, an urge to write that was akin to a thirsty man begging for water, and not just write, but chronicle the stories of others, so that their words and thoughts and experiences would not be lost. A record, Jess decided, of all those who will speak for themselves and for others who are gone, so that we will not forget. Jess stood up, brushed herself off, and went to look for a pen and paper.